The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet cemetery. A young boy, no older than 6, stood alone beside a fresh grave, his small hands clutching the edges of a wilted flower. His face, though innocent, bore the weight of a sadness far beyond his years. He stood there, staring at the earth as if it held all the answers to his longing heart. His voice, soft yet filled with desperation, broke the stillness. "Get up, Mommy, I'm hungry." The words hung in the air, echoing through the graveyard like a ghost of the past. The world around him seemed to hold its breath, the wind pausing as if listening, waiting for something to happen. But there was no answer, only the rustling of the leaves, as though the earth itself was silent in its grief. What would a child know of loss this deep? How could a tiny voice, barely above a whisper, demand the return of a loved one who was no longer there? This was no ordinary grave, no ordinary mother. This child wasn't just mourning the loss of his mom. He was speaking to her, as if expecting her to rise from the earth and comfort him. The grief in his words wasn't just a cry for food or affection. It was the pain of a child who had lost the most precious person in his life, and somehow still believed she could hear him, still hoped she could answer him. As he stood there, his wide eyes searching the grave as if willing her to appear, something unexpected stirred in the air. The atmosphere seemed to shift, a strange chill running through the breeze. Was it the wind? Was it his imagination? Or was it something else, something that defied the rules of the world he knew? The child took a step forward, his voice trembling now. "Mommy, please, I'm hungry." The words were so simple, yet they carried the weight of a lifetime. He had no idea what he was asking, no concept of what was impossible, no understanding that what he was demanding could never be. All he knew was that he wanted his mother back. And then, in that moment, something happened that no one could have predicted. Something that would change the course of this story forever. The ground beneath the boy's feet seemed to shift, a soft rumble that sent a shiver down his spine. His eyes widened, and he took a step back, his small feet stumbling over the uneven ground. He reached out instinctively, grabbing the edge of the gravestone for support. For a brief moment, he thought he had imagined it, that the earth was simply playing tricks on him. But then, the unexpected occurred. From beneath the ground, a faint sound echoed, a whisper so soft it was almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to the child's ears. It was a voice that sounded so familiar, so comforting, yet filled with an otherworldly quality. The boy's breath caught in his throat as the sound grew louder, clearer. "Mommy?" he whispered, his voice barely above a breath, his heart racing in his chest. Could it really be her? Could she have heard him? Could she have somehow returned, just as he had wished? He took another step forward, his eyes never leaving the spot where the voice seemed to be coming from. The earth trembled once more, this time with a force that sent a wave of fear through him. He couldn't tear his eyes away. He couldn't move. It felt as though the entire world had paused, waiting for something to happen. And then, with a sudden jolt, the ground beneath the grave cracked. A deep, echoing sound reverberated through the air, sending the boy stumbling back. The flower he had been holding fell from his hands, drifting in the wind as if caught in some invisible force. The child's heart raced. What was happening? Was this a dream? Could he be imagining it all? His mind screamed for him to run, to get away from the grave, but his legs wouldn't move. He stood there frozen, staring at the spot where the earth was now shifting in an unnatural way. And then, as though to confirm his worst fear, something began to rise from the earth. It wasn't his mother, not in the way he remembered her. No, it was something else. Something strange, something that didn't belong. A figure, emerging slowly from the ground, as if the very soil was unwilling to let it go. The boy's eyes widened in terror, his breath coming in short gasps. What was happening? What was this thing? Was it his mother? Had she come back? Or was this something far darker, far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined? As the figure continued to emerge from the grave, the boy took a hesitant step back, his tiny body trembling with fear. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Was this some kind of miracle? Or was it a curse, something he had called forth by accident, something that would never let him go. The ground around the grave began to crack open wider, revealing more of the figure beneath. It was tall, too tall for any human. Its features were blurry, its body indistinct, as though it had been pulled from the depths of the earth itself. The child's pulse quickened, his hands shaking as he took another step backward. What his feet felt like lead, unwilling to obey. The whispers grew louder, and the boy's heart skipped a beat. The voice? It was getting clearer, but it wasn't his mother's. It was something else, something ancient, something that had been buried for far too long. "Mommy?" he whispered once more, but the word felt empty, as if the sound had lost all meaning. The fear in his chest grew heavier, and he realized, too late, that he had made a terrible mistake. What was this thing? What had he unleashed? And would he ever be able to undo it? The figure was almost fully out now, its presence unmistakable. The boy, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and dread, stood frozen, staring at what had come from the grave, unable to look away. And just as the figure reached out for him, the video cuts to black. What happens next? Stay tuned to find out. The scene remained frozen in the pitch-black screen for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the pounding of the boy's heart in his chest, the air thick with an unease that sent chills down his spine. The boy's name was Amir, and he wasn't just any child. He had lost his mother Zara in an accident just a few months ago. She had been his world, the center of his universe. His father, Rashid, had been absent most of Amir's life, consumed by work and his own struggles. Zara had been the one who had comforted him, the one who had held his hand through the darkest nights. Losing her had left an unfillable void, a wound that felt as though it would never heal. The day of her funeral had been the hardest of Amir's life. He couldn't understand why she wasn't there anymore. He hadn't been allowed to say goodbye, and the overwhelming grief had been too much for a child his age. All he knew was that his mother was gone, and nothing in his small world would ever be the same. He hadn't cried much. Instead, he had withdrawn into himself, sitting quietly by her grave, hoping that somehow, by just being near her, she would return. And so he began to visit the cemetery every day after school, bringing her flowers, talking to her as if she could still hear him. His father had tried to stop him, tried to explain that she was gone, but Amir refused to believe it. In his young mind, she could never truly be gone. The more he visited, the more he spoke to her, the more he convinced himself that she would one day return. That was until today. Today, as he stood there, repeating those desperate words, "Get up, Mommy, I'm hungry." Something had happened. Something he couldn't explain. The grave had shaken, the earth had moved, and now there was something else. The boy took a deep breath, trying to steady himself as the figure loomed before him. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its body flickering in and out of focus. Its face remained shadowed, indistinct, but Amir could feel its presence, its eyes on him. The whispers had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. For a moment, Amir thought it was a dream, that he would wake up at any moment and find himself back in his bed. But the cold, damp air around him felt all too real. He took another step back, his feet stumbling over the uneven ground, but he couldn't look away. His mind screamed for him to run, to leave the cemetery, but his legs felt heavy, like they were glued to the earth. He knew, deep down, that running wouldn't change what was happening. The grave had been disturbed, and now whatever had been buried was coming to the surface. Amir's thoughts raced. Could it be his mother? Could she have somehow come back from the dead? The thought seemed impossible, but what other explanation was there for this strange figure emerging from the grave? But as he stared at it, his heart sank. This wasn't his mother. It couldn't be. The figure, though vaguely familiar, was different. There was something wrong about it, something dark and unsettling. This wasn't the warmth of his mother's embrace. This wasn't the voice that had soothed his fears. This was something else, something that had been buried deep beneath the earth for a reason. The figure stepped forward, its form growing clearer, and with it, a growing sense of dread crept over Amir. He couldn't move. His mind screamed for him to scream, to cry out for help, but the words caught in his throat. The air around him thickened, pressing down on him, suffocating him. His eyes darted around the cemetery, looking for an escape, but there was none. He was trapped. And then the figure spoke. The voice was not his mother's. It was deeper, more guttural, and filled with an ancient malice. It echoed in the air, sending a wave of fear through Amir's entire body. "You called me," the voice rumbled, its words slow and deliberate. "You asked for me, child." Amir's breath caught in his throat. He didn't understand. He hadn't meant to summon anything. He hadn't meant to do anything wrong. All he had wanted was to see his mother again, to feel her warmth, to hear her voice. But now something had come from the grave, and it wasn't his mother. The figure reached out with long, twisted fingers, its movements jerky, unnatural. Amir took another step back, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind screamed for him to run, but he couldn't. The fear had paralyzed him. He was caught in its gaze, unable to move, unable to think. What are you?" Amir managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. The figure's head tilted slightly as if considering the question. "I am what was left behind," it said, its voice dripping with cold amusement. "I am the thing that sleeps beneath the earth, the thing that you disturbed. You called for your mother, but instead you awakened me." The words sent a chill down Amir's spine, and for the first time, he understood the horror of what he had done. He hadn't just called for his mother. He had disturbed something ancient, something that had been buried for a reason. This was no simple ghost. This was something far darker, far more dangerous. Amir's thoughts turned to his father. Had his father known about this? Was there something in their family's past that he had kept hidden from Amir? Had his mother been more than just a woman who had loved him? Was there something about her, something about their family, that had invited this darkness into their lives? But before he could think further, the figure moved again, this time quicker, its fingers reaching for him with terrifying speed. Amir took a step back, his heart racing, but the figure's hand was already upon him. He could feel its coldness, its unnatural strength, as it gripped his arm. "I've been waiting," it whispered, its breath foul and unnatural, sending a wave of nausea through Amir's body. "And now you will never leave." And with that, the earth seemed to shift once more. The cemetery around them seemed to come alive, the shadows growing longer, the air heavier, as though the very ground itself was closing in on Amir. He tried to scream, to pull away, but his body wouldn't obey. The figure's grip tightened, and Amir's vision blurred as darkness began to creep in from the edges of his sight. What was happening? Was this the end? Would he ever escape the grip of whatever had risen from his mother's grave? The screen cuts to black once more. What happens next? Stay tuned. The darkness crept closer, consuming everything around Amir. His body was frozen, trapped in the grip of the figure that loomed above him, its cold fingers tightening around his arm. The cemetery, once familiar, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows, the air thick and suffocating. Amir's vision blurred as the darkness seeped into his mind, pulling him into a state of panic and dread. He could barely breathe, could barely think, as the figure's voice echoed in his ears. "I've been waiting for so long, child," it murmured, its voice like a death rattle, cold and empty. "And now you will be mine." Terror surged through Amir's veins as he struggled against the figure's grasp, but his body refused to obey. He was powerless, unable to break free, unable to escape. Everything around him seemed to collapse, the graveyard twisting into a nightmare. But then, as if on instinct, a memory flashed in Amir's mind. His mother's voice, soft, comforting, and full of love. He remembered how she would hold him close, how she would tell him that no matter what, she would always be there for him. In that moment, something shifted within Amir. He wasn't just a helpless child anymore. He was her son, and he wouldn't let this darkness take him. With a surge of strength he didn't know he had, Amir yanked his arm free from the figure's grip. His heart pounded as he stumbled backward, the earth beneath him shifting like it was alive, trying to pull him back into its cold embrace. But Amir didn't stop. He kept moving, each step fueled by the memory of his mother's love, each step defying the terror that surrounded him. The figure let out a low growl, its form flickering as if it were struggling to hold itself together. "You cannot escape," it hissed, its voice trembling with rage. "You cannot outrun what you've awakened." But Amir didn't listen. He didn't need to. The memories of his mother's love filled him with a strength he never knew he had. He wasn't alone. He would never be alone. And with that, he turned and ran. As he ran, the cemetery around him seemed to blur, the darkness retreating in the wake of his determination. He didn't know where he was going, didn't know if he would make it out alive. But one thing was clear: he had to keep moving. He had to get away from the thing that had risen from the grave, the thing that had been waiting for him. Amir ran until his lungs burned, until his legs felt like they would give out. But he didn't stop. The whispers, the growls, the chilling presence of the figure all faded as he pushed forward, the light from the streetlights ahead guiding him toward safety. And then, just as he reached the gates of the cemetery, he felt a sudden shift in the air. The oppressive weight that had been following him lifted, and the ground beneath him seemed to stabilize. He turned, half expecting to see the figure looming behind him. But there was nothing. The cemetery was silent once more. Amir stood there, breathing heavily, his heart still racing, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Had he really escaped? Was it over? As he turned away and began walking home, the weight of the night's events began to settle in. He still didn't fully understand what had happened, what that figure had been, or why it had been drawn to him. But one thing was certain: his mother's love had saved him. She had always been there, even in death, protecting him from the darkness that tried to consume him. And maybe, just maybe, she was watching over him now, guiding him through the fear and uncertainty. Back at home, as Amir sat quietly in his room, his thoughts drifted to the graveyard and the figure he had faced. He didn't know if it was truly gone, or if it was just waiting for the next time. But he did know one thing: he wasn't afraid anymore. He had survived. And with his mother's love still in his heart, he knew he could face anything. The next day, Amir returned to the cemetery, but this time, he didn't go with fear. He went with a sense of peace, a sense of closure. His mother's grave was still there, still a part of him, but he no longer felt the overwhelming need to call her back. She was gone, yes, but in her absence, she had left him with something stronger: his own strength, his own will to survive. As he stood by her grave, a soft breeze stirred the air, and for a moment, Amir swore he could feel her presence, as if she was right there beside him, whispering in his ear. He smiled, feeling the warmth of her love surround him. And with that, Amir turned and walked away, the cemetery behind him now nothing more than a place of memories, a place where his mother's love would always remain. The story had come to an end, but Amir's journey was just beginning.